Hello everyone, and this week we are looking at chapter 26. So we are looking at the turbulent 60s. So in this chapter, we examine the 1960s, a decade filled with hope and conflict. So on one hand, this was a time when many Americans believed government could help solve some major national problems such as poverty, racial injustice, and lack of access to education and healthcare. On the other hand, the decade also exposed major divisions over war, civil rights, culture, and the meaning of freedom. So that's what you're going to be looking at in chapter 26. Here are your learning objectives for chapter 26. Video there for you. So let's kind of look very broadly over the major things that you're going to see in chapter 26. So the chapter starts out with President JFK, John F. Kennedy, and his vision of the new frontier. So Kennedy really presented himself as a new kind of leader for modern America, one that was prosperous, optimistic, and ready to meet global challenges. Although his domestic accomplishments were limited, his presidency helped build momentum for a more active federal government. In foreign policy, however, Kennedy remained committed to Cold War containment, which meant taking a strong stand against communism around the world. So this chapter then is going to move to the civil rights movement. You'll talk about the Bay of Pigs, the Berlin crisis, the Cuban Missile Crisis. So that's what this map is for. Then we switch over to the civil rights movement, and it intensified dramatically in the 1960s. So things had really started to pick up in the 1950s. We had Brown v. Board, we have the rollout of that, and then we have like the Montgomery bus boycott in the 50s. So now we're looking at freedom riders, student activists, church leaders, and local organizers are starting to challenge segregation and voter suppression through nonviolent protest. Sometimes they use direct action and also from grassroots organizing. Their courage and the violent resistance towards them pushed the federal government to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which you're going to read about. These were started by Kennedy, but they were carried on by Johnson after Kennedy's assassination. So Johnson is going to use his political skills to pass an ambitious liberal program known as the Great Society. And this is where President Johnson uses his administration to expand federal support for education, healthcare, anti-poverty efforts, the arts, and the environment. And for a moment, it seemed possible that the federal government could create a more just and equal society. So all of these things are going to be addressed by Johnson in his Great Society. However, the same time period is overshadowed by what is happening in Vietnam and the Vietnam War. As U.S. involvement expanded, Americans increasingly questioned whether liberal reform at home could survive a costly and destructive war abroad. And Vietnam became a turning point that weakened public trust in government and fueled a lot of protest movements across the country. And then finally, what the chapter is going to explore are broader changes and challenges that come, and these challenges come to liberalism. So we're going to see young activists, women, Chicanos, and Native Americans, gay activists, and others demanding deeper change. And at the same time, conservatives argued that government had become too large and society too unstable. And by the end of the decade, the United States is deeply divided over what kind of nation it should become. So what this chapter does, actually, we're going to pause right there. I want to really dive into comparing the African American, the Chicano, and the American Indian movement. So we're going to switch focus for a few minutes, and we're going to talk about those three civil rights movements that are happening kind of throughout time and sometimes coming together. So let's look at those for a second. Okay, so bear with me because we're going to back up just a little bit to kind of get us all caught up with everything. So you guys remember reading about the bus boycott, Martin Luther King Jr. And what I want you to know about these are non-violent. We're going to protest in a way that we are not acting out in violence, right? Violence may be used against us, but we are not going to use violence in retaliation. So whatever they're doing, We were just supposed to sit there and take it. So during the civil rights movement, the African American civil rights movement especially, what you'll notice is like the sit-ins at those counters, they would go and just dump salt and pepper and ketchup and mustard and mayonnaise like all over their heads, and they just sat there and they took it. And it was blacks participating, but also you do have whites that are participating in these too. So all of these things, the boycotts, the sit-ins, the marches, all of that, those were non-violent. On the flip side, you do see others that are going to take a more militant or a more violent approach. Probably the biggest name that comes to mind when we talk about that is this guy, Malcolm X. So Malcolm X had a really, really rough past, and he was sent to prison in 1946, and that's where he's going to convert to the Nation of Islam. He grew up very poor, and that's why he has such a troubled past. And he just kind of like started doing petty crimes, like stealing food and stuff, and then it got kind of escalated, and that's what's going to lead to his arrest. When he's released from prison in 1952, though, he quickly becomes like this very loud and outspoken member of the radicalized right wing of the civil rights movement, the more violent movement. However, he does break ties with the Nation of Islam in 1964. What he does is he ends up taking a trip to like North Africa and over into the Holy Lands, and he changes his name to Al-Hajj Malik al-Shabazz. He comes back from that trip a completely changed person. He has a more non-violent approach, and unfortunately, before we can see him really come to fruition, we can see everything that's happening, he is assassinated by Thomas Hagen, a member of the Nation of Islam back here in the States. There's a lot of conspiracy surrounding that, like was it actually the FBI? For our point and our reason, that doesn't really matter why he's assassinated. He's just assassinated before we can see his reconciliation, right? So then moving on, this is also really important. We have the Black Panther Party. They do a lot of good. They have such a bad rap, but they actually do a lot of good. They're founded by Huey Newton and Bobby Seale in Oakland, California in 1966, and they had a very specific platform with 10 points. Google it, search it, but basically, we want freedom. We want to determine our Black community, we want employment. We want the capitalists to quit stealing from the Black community. We want decent housing. We don't want discriminatory housing practices on us anymore. We want education for our people that talks about African history. We want a role in present day society. We want Black men to be exempt from military service. That's more the radical part of it. We want immediate end to brutality, police brutality, and murder. We want freedom for all Black men that are in state, county, federal judges and prisons and jails. So these are all the things that they're bringing about, right? And there's more points to that, but they committed themselves to projecting this violent image. The Brown Berets of the Chicano movement are going to do the same. So within every movement, you have your peaceful and you have your more violent. And that's what we're seeing with the Black Panther Party, is the more violent stance, the more militant stance. I also want to point out this really important picture that comes out during the African American Civil Rights Movement. This is the 1968 Olympics. Tommy Smith, this guy right here, he's originally from East Texas, not far from my hometown of Paris. He's from Clarksville, Texas. He's going to place first in the 200-meter sprint. John Carlos attended the same university that I did for graduate school at East Texas A&M. He is awarded, so he gets third place in the same. This gentleman is from Australia. He wins second place. And what they are doing is they are, instead of doing this during the national anthem, hand across the heart, they're doing this. It was not meant to be disrespectful to the national anthem. What it was meant was just to raise awareness. And you can read here what all they do, what they're representing here. So now I want to move in really, really quickly to the Chicano movement. The Chicano movement actually helps start this African American civil rights movement. They have some major court cases Mexican Americans do. They're going to help set the precedent for the Brown v. Board case. One of those is Mendez versus Westminster. And this is coming out of California, where California is like, you can't segregate kids based on background, you can't segregate Latino children, Mexican children. So that's going to help set the precedent for Brown v. Board. Hernandez v. Texas, this was about an all-white jury and a Mexican criminal coming before them. So the case is like you have to have a jury of your peers. So it's going to uphold the 14th Amendment. Also, what the Chicano movement does, the United Farm Workers, they are really looking at restoration of land, rights for farm workers, and education reforms. That sounds a lot like what the Black community wanted too, right? We want not just a white history, we want a history that represents everyone in America. So this gentleman, Tijerina, he's going to take off and he is talking about restoration of land and the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo that happened after the Mexican-American War. So he's like, that land was supposed to be ours. It was stolen from us. So we want it back. So that's about restoration of land and land rights. Then we have these two that are pretty famous. This is Chavez and Huerta, and they are working on rights for farm workers, especially those migrant workers who move with the crops. So they are concerned with urban problems, and they're seeking to end those, and then they turn to rural farm problems after that. And they're doing a lot. Then you have a young group of Chicanos that want education reforms. Imagine this. We want education about Spanish exploration, about Spanish settlement, about Mexicans winning the war and gaining their independence. Because why does that matter? Because New Mexico, Texas, Arizona, Colorado, Utah, California, and a few others, those are all Mexican territory. That was all Mexican heritage. That's all Spanish heritage. Why are we not learning about that history? Why do we learn about the conquistadors and then all of a sudden we flip over and we learn about the 13 colonies, but nothing else that's happening in the South and the Southwest? We want that brought up. We want bilingual education taught because guess what? Most predominant people, the predominant language in the Southwest in the United States is Spanish. You don't have to agree with that. You can say we're an English-speaking country. That's fine. But most people in the Southwest were speaking Spanish because they're immigrants moving over. And this was all Mexican territory, Spanish territory before. So they are fighting for the same things that African Americans are fighting for when it comes to education. And then you have the American Indian movement. And look at what they're fighting for. Economic independence, revitalization of traditional culture, protection of legal rights, autonomy over their own lands, right? There is a court case that comes out in the early 1920s, Lone Wolf versus Hitchcock, that really helps you understand why American Indians are thought of in a certain way by Anglos. They were seen as an ignorant, dependent race, and that came out in this court case. They said that. Native Americans were not great. I think actually, guys, this was not before 1924. I'm getting it mixed up with the citizenship. Native Americans were granted U.S. citizenship in 1924. Oh, thanks. We were already citizens of this land, but that's cool. Thanks for recognizing that. Also, what's really devastating to the American Indians is more than 100 tribes were terminated in 1945. And when you were terminated, guess what? You lose all tribal lands, all claims to your land when you no longer just poof, you don't exist anymore. But I'm still here. I still exist. So that's another major thing with Native Americans. So we're going to see the American Indian movement, also known as AIM or the Red Movement, really pick up. And they are going to try some. Native Americans have been doing this for a long time. They tried peace treaties. They tried, the peaceful way. They tried the militant way. So there's kind of this mixture of both that's happening. And this really picks up in the late 60s, early 70s when we have the American Indian movement. And you can see the different things that they're trying. Occupation of Alcatraz. There is this great drunk history episode about the occupation of Alcatraz. You should watch it. It's amazing. They do a takeover of Wounded Knee, and then they also stage The Longest Walk. So these are things that are happening all at the same time that your book is briefly going to touch on. I just wanted to do some more for you because guess what? You have an essay that's due this week that you're going to compare these three movements. So I want you to compare and contrast these three movements. What similarities do they have? What differences do they have? What is their end goal? And read more about that in the assignments located at the bottom of this module.